Welcome. You're listening to InDepth Talks, Project After Architecture, a segment dedicated to shed light on the experiences and perspectives of architecture graduates. Our guest today is Kian Hosseinnia, a dedicated academic with a deep interest in history, architecture, and philosophy. He holds a degree from the Harvard Graduate School of Design and is currently pursuing a Ph.D. at Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation. Kian's work bridges multiple disciplines, offering a unique perspective on the intersections of design, historical inquiry, and theoretical thought. With a bit of help from Prava, dear friend, yours and ours, we know that you had some of your initial years in Iran before moving to Canada. And we thought that the best place to start is to perhaps unpack that, the shift
hmm
or the experience of moving from one space to another, which is radically different in terms of the cultural climate and the political landscape,
hmm
and how instrumental was this shift in shaping your views on philosophy, history, and architecture? Excuse me for saying all these three in the same breath, but please break them
No,
down
that's
as
good.
well.
No, that's good. I don't think they're that separate actually. So yeah, it makes sense that they appear in the same question. Um, yeah, so I actually moved when I was 17, and this was in 2012. I moved to Toronto, Canada, from Tehran, in Iran. So yeah, it was a pretty interesting age to move. My family decided to migrate, so we migrated as a family, and it things happened pretty quickly, I would say. Like I didn't know about the move until like everything was in order, and we were told by our parents, like me and my sister, and within I would say like months we were already in Toronto. So yeah, it was a pretty quick experience. Um, and of course, like initially, once you're especially when you're younger, I mean, you're not really processing like everything that's taking place, but a lot of the initial sort of experiences are really about just like finding your way in the new place that you're in. Or like, okay, so school, what is that like here? Obviously, very different from what it was like in Iran on many levels, like both in terms of social life, in terms of education, in terms of like teacher-student relationships, all these things being like radically different, and of course like language being a very big one. So I did high school for 2 years in Toronto. Most of it just like both trying to figure out my place in the new country, but also trying to explore, um, like use this opportunity to sort of explore new aspects of myself that I hadn't had the chance to explore in my old setting. So that was a very transformative 2 years because it sort of pushed me into a very new area. Um, Also, like having really good teachers was really helpful. So that was the inflection point, and then I started doing architecture and philosophy at the University of Toronto with my bachelor's, and that's when I actually sort of were properly introduced to things like philosophy and architecture, what history also. So the three things that you mentioned, all sort of coming out at the same time, um, and they were always interrelated for me because philosophy was kind of a way for me to explore many of my personal questions. And then architecture was, especially at that level, it wasn't that serious yet. Like we were really free during our bachelor's. So architecture was as a way, like it kind of became an experimental ground for me to think about some ideas in a different language, language of like form, drawing, like all these things. Pretty naively, I would say, but like it was nice to have like multiple ways of thinking through things rather than just text, for instance, like reading only. So I was able to read and then like jump on some drawing like Rhino or whatever, and then explore some thoughts there. And then history came in around that time as well, but it wasn't as influential until later in my bachelor's. Maybe it was third year or something like that, where again, like an influence of a good teacher. So I think that has been a pretty big deal in my development. Like I can point to, specific teachers that sort of put me on very specific trajectories just because of the way that they yeah, like they handle teaching, like they the way that they took that job seriously, and but also um were human during that process, so you could relate to them at a level that it was more personal, but also like learn from them at levels that were not necessarily personal. So it was sort of that moment where I had this professor who was teaching our history class, and that really made me realize the sort of importance of thinking about historical questions and their impact on you as you sort of think about them. So that's when history became a part in my thinking as well. So the three things that you pointed out relatively around the same time in different moments, but they always sort of were intermingled, and they were never sort of separate in that sense.
Right. So that answers the part about the philosophy, history, and architecture. Would you shine some light on the distinction between the kind of academia that you explored in the West versus back in Iran?
Hmm. Right. Yeah, that's also a good question because it's also pretty important for my development, I would say. So in Iran, of course, I was younger, so I wasn't yet in an academic setting per se. Like I was in a university, but I was in an educational system that was very different. So the way that I would characterize it is that we basically had no humanities. We didn't have that. I mean, the only sort of um, access to that we had were through various kinds of religious studies. So we had like Quranic studies or religious thought. So that was kind of what, and some like Farsi literature, but also not as critical, I would say. So we didn't really have that, and for me, the major impact of being introduced to Western academia was that access to humanities, like this whole domain of thinking that really allows you to develop critical thought. Like it allows you to think through things in a slow but steady way, structured way. Which really didn't exist back there, and there are good reasons for why that doesn't exist. But for me, like the personal impact that it had was that before I moved, I was already sort of looking at certain philosophical and religious texts, but I didn't have the tools to really think about them. And that sort of space of humanities in Western academia was where I was given the tools and the space to really be able to um, like think through some of the questions in a structured way rather than just, like a messy kind of picking up one book and not really knowing where to start. And then, so that was the main thing that, and I think that is one of the major differences, both, for myself, but also I think generally, like yeah, that's lack of access to that kind of thinking.
Okay, so if I understand this correctly, the major point of distinction that you point out is access and perhaps the
Mm,
flexibility in terms of humanities in the West and the religious accent back in Tehran. So, in that sense,
hmm.
how would you position the framing of creation of knowledge, knowledge in itself, and ignorance in both these contexts?
Yeah, that's also a really amazing question. Okay, let me think about this. Yeah, so you said creation of knowledge and access. Is that what you asked?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I think um, if you asked me this question maybe like 3, 4 years ago, I would have a very different answer. I would say yes, in the West you can produce knowledge with no restrictions, and in the East it's so difficult. I would sort of give you that kind of answer. But right now, I would say something slightly different. And I would say that I think the things that are developed as knowledge are different in both contexts. So, in the context that I was in initially in Iran, what is considered knowledge, I would say, maybe not in the like it could be better, but what I would say what the basis of knowledge is I would say moral thought, like morality. So that's I mean, of course, the connection to religion, all those sorts of all those forms of thinking. So that's the basis of um, knowledge production in my initial context. But in the context that I moved to, moral knowledge was not really primary. I mean, certain people still pursue, ethics, like they study various kinds of ethics in school, etc. But still, the foundation of the knowledge isn't this sort of personal sense of what it means to be good. It's more of like an objective, all right, how do we advance like knowledge as such for for everyone or something like that. So I think the distinction is really like what is valued as a knowledge object rather than knowledge itself. And that's kind of my criticism actually of Western academia, which is that we don't here, there is not that much room for thinking about meaning. It's mostly sort of uh, like a lot of information, a lot of critical analysis of information, but then that last step of, all right, so what implications does this have for like what does it mean to be human or something like that? So that's what's different to me. But then in Iran, you focus on that meaning question and you sort of miss out on all the critical aspects. So there's fault on both ends. Of course, here there is more flexibility to do certain things. Um, but yeah, I would say that after having been here for a while and being immersed in the context, yeah, I see certain flaws as well as differences.
I would like to share an anecdote, but before I do that, have you heard of Quran Journal?
I don't think so, no.
It's a journal based in Serbia,
Hmm.
but I think last year they had a launch at AA. The editor in chief was in attendance, and also Kenneth Frampton was in attendance.
Okay.
So it was
Yeah.
particularly interesting. And it explores the intersection of architecture and philosophy. And
Hmm.
I found that very interesting. So I was also attending that particular talk. And they did talk about the influence of philosophy in architecture and how the intersection has grounds of producing novelty, if you
Hmm.
will, and how it should be integrated into the current architectural academia. Because right now the focus is simply on architectural studies, theory, and to a
Hmm.
certain extent, some kind of history in architecture. But the introduction of this particular segment, where the students get an opportunity to perhaps merge philosophical threads and explore architecture in a new light, was what was being proposed. Um, but I couldn't help but notice that much of this discourse was shaped around Western philosophy. So they did
Hmm.
mention Socrates and Plato, and it brought me to question that would I even had this conversation with the editor in chief of that journal, Peter Boyanik, and I asked him that would the journal in the future be open to ideas from the eastern side of
Hmm.
the philosophical landscape? You have Sufism, Taoism.
Hmm.
Um, but the point here being is that did you also experience this certain lack of immersion or kind of like a gate between Western philosophy and Eastern philosophy, where not a lot of influence of the East is welcomed into the West? And if
Hmm.
so, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean that's for sure. I mean, so my own I personally am much more familiar with Western philosophy actually because I was educated in this context. So I see where that flaw is. I mean, historically, Eastern philosophy has a direct sort of influence on Western. Like, there is no line, like Eastern philosophy feeds into Western philosophy very directly. But what is, I guess, is the situation now is that people tend to think of this thing called Western philosophy as something that's separate from, all sorts of other kinds of thought. And up until recently, actually, uh, a lot of scholars wouldn't even classify a lot of Eastern like knowledge systems as philosophy. It would be like, oh, it's just something that happened before the rise of philosophy in Greece or something like that. So there is obviously a pretty big bias. Um, I think what for me, like how I came to that question and how I tried to answer it wasn't necessarily to, okay, now like let me read, all sorts of Eastern philosophy and try to integrate it, but rather it was a process of, okay, how can I learn um how do I say this? Okay, by taking other forms of thought seriously, right? Like whether that's some ancient form of thought or some contemporary Eastern, whatever, by taking that seriously as an equally intellectually rigorous, activity than as sort of Western philosophy, how can I actually learn about how to be a human in different ways? Because people are everyone is thinking on more or less the same level, I would say. It's just that the things that they think about are different. Um, and that's how you sort of produce different bodies of knowledge. Some of which is not great because, people don't have necessarily access to good teaching or something like that. Um, but yeah, in terms of architecture, what I'm trying to think, I mean, today I would say even Western philosophy is pretty separate from architectural practice. Like I don't really see that connection happening even now. I mean, there are attempts like the thing that you described, that moment with Fountain
Mm-hmm.
and others. But I would say that still sort of stays within a small sort of body of academia, not even like the whole of academia. It's like a very local thing, and it rarely even translates into like thinking about building in the professional realm. And I mean, the reasons for that are like very complex. And the one thing that I would point out to is that I mean the values of um, knowledge production in academia are just radically different from the values of, various kinds of offices that need to make money by, so I mean, the questions are fundamentally different. The approaches are fundamentally different. And also like the people that are thinking about architectural theory or philosophy and some, things in that line, oftentimes are like not even practicing architects, which is not a bad thing. Like, I mean, we need philosophers, but I think what I'm trying to point to is that question of how to integrate theory and practice, or how to bring sort of other kinds of theoretical frameworks, whether from the East, etc., into practice. I think that question itself needs to be reformulated. And I think it should sort of be asked something like, how can we, in school, how can we produce individuals who are both like really good thinkers and really good makers? I think that's the question that needs to be asked, because um, you don't need to sort of design theoretically or like write architecturally or something like that. I think what would actually produce a big impact would be that you would have people that are really good critical thinkers and have their own sort of values and know how to make things. And once they're out there in the world, then the decisions that are made are like hopefully different, rather than try to apply someone's theory into practice, if that makes sense. And that would start, I think, in sort of during people's like during architects' education, where instead of studio being a place where you apply theory, and like history classes being a place where you sort of learn some theory that you will later apply, I kind of almost want to see these two things as separate things. Like you do design in studio, you learn, but you don't just do design. You learn how to work with materials. You learn how it means to actually build things like by hand, almost a physical kind of
Yeah.
knowledge, right? And then in like other kinds of classes, you sit and you think about ideas that hopefully will lead you to think deeper about again that question of like what it means to be human, what is our place, like how can we think through our place in the world, etc. That's how you produce like a full human who's able to address both sort of material questions on site, like okay, how do we put one brick on another, but also is able to ask or answer a moral dilemma or something like that. So that's how I see theory and practice interacting with each other.
Absolutely. That kind of partly responds to my concerns of, how philosophy and phenomenology are radically
Mm.
interesting concepts, but we don't quite know how deeply or how widely dived into they are outside of
Hmm.
academia, right? And you did suggest some measures in how that could be done. And I'm actually curious of how do you take this take forward and
Hmm.
bring it into effect in your own body of work and practice.
Yeah.
And along with that, it would be great if you could also reflect on your journey from Harvard to Columbia and also some interesting, worthwhile segments that I've missed out on.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, I think it relates because I can sort of let me start by my sort of architectural education and what I realize is missing like later on and how that sort of realization brought me to this kind of thinking that I'm proposing now. Um, I mean, anyone who's gone through architecture school knows that your primary job is to sit behind a laptop or a computer or something that, some sort of surface. Maybe it's a drawing surface even, maybe drawing by hand, I don't know. But you're producing all sorts of representations, right? Whether plans, sections, renderings, whatnot. What is really rare is for students to actually know how to work with materials. We rarely sort of sit down and be like, all right, clay. How do we deal with clay? Who knows how to work with clay? You know, and let's spend some time, building with clay and that kind of thing I realize is missing when I was at Harvard. I already had my bachelor's. And I realized that a lot of the discussions that I'm having with my faculty, with my professors, and a lot of the questions that I'm trying to answer are not necessarily architectural questions. They are representational questions. Like, all right, how to represent something, how to like draw something that is, clear, how to. So I realized that, well, actually, at the end of the day, I'm not interacting with buildings. I'm a very particular kind of individual who's being trained to be absent from the construction site for most of my working time, produce certain documents that are then taken to the construction site and used by others, contractors, builders, etc., to then produce something that, again, they haven't designed. So there's this kind of separation between the people who are supposedly arranging matter, the people who are thinking how matter should be arranged, and the people who actually arrange it. So that sort of gap was something that I noticed, and I slowly started to think about how to overcome that. And it's difficult because there isn't that many avenues actually in architecture schools to work with that. So I decided to, um, once I sort of moved to my PhD, to really use that PhD time to first work on those historical and philosophical problems, but then try to find time outside of that and be able to learn some craft, whatever that is. Not because I'm gonna become a builder, because I'm sure there's a lot of people who are much more qualified. But for me to be able to get a certain kind of knowledge that you can only get by interacting with materials. And that's what I was proposing before in terms of these two things being separate, because I think there is this thing called material knowledge that we need to take as seriously as theoretical knowledge. Right now, architecture schools kind of take both too loosely, through this third thing called representations. You can produce all sorts of drawings that tell you how matter works and how ideas are incorporated in these drawings. But at the end of the day, you're not really thinking seriously about materials. Neither are you thinking seriously about ideas. So that's my own personal kind of trajectory for how I sort of arrived at this kind of thinking now, and I'm sure it will develop, and others might disagree, and through conversations, I'm sure it will change. But this is a response, like my response to something that I noticed through that trajectory of moving through architecture schools, both in Toronto, but also Harvard, which is its own sort of particular space, I would say.
It's a very interesting take. And as you rightly pointed out, these are all very integral aspects of a wholesome architectural education, right? You need to have your theoretical knowledge, your material knowledge, but at the same time, you also need to be well aware of the push and pull forces of the market. Because when you get into practice, you have to be well acclimatized to that kind of commercialization of architecture in a way.
Hmm.
And I think a lot of architectural pedagogies struggle on that aspect,
Yeah.
delivering a wholesome architectural education. So I wanted to know your thoughts on if at all there were measures or policies in place to frame such an architectural education delivery system that touches upon all of these aspects, but at the same time does not lose its focus on developing a niche for every individual who's
Hmm.
interested in a particular area of investigation. How would you go about framing such a pedagogy?
Yeah. I mean, so I think Harvard is an interesting example actually because I think they have uh, more recently sort of tried to explore that third category that you're describing, which is, how to understand, architecture as a professional practice, how to work. Uh, and a lot of the pedagogy and classes that we end up taking at that particular school are framed around that. Um, so a lot of people actually gain a lot from that because that's their goal. They want to become entrepreneurs, they want to become professionals, and they do end up getting the skills in that school and going out in the world. But yeah, what you're pointing out is interesting because there's very different aspects of what it means to build anything that is very difficult to integrate in one educational system that is meant for everyone, right? And I think that's the struggle that we're seeing. Like Harvard for some time was very theoretical, and then it now is very practice oriented, and but less. Maybe I don't really know about this earlier history, but I haven't seen a lot of material knowledge there per se. But I think the sort of solution would be to just like hire very different teachers, like people who are able to teach very different classes that cater to um, various kinds of questions so that there's space for people to develop whichever aspect that they see is more crucial for them or they relate to more. But I think the more, again, like I think the problem is bigger than like a single institution. I think the larger problem is how sort of architecture as a modern sort of discipline has been separated from other kinds of labor. Like there used to be, like earlier, like before sort of the rise of this particular kind of profession, there wasn't one single person or like a group of people who would, you know, put ideas on paper and then give it to other people and then for other people to build. It was much more of like a mixed, activity where the person who was like the head of a construction site or some position like that would be someone who had some kind of seniority in craft or like someone who had built a lot of stuff knew how things worked and then sort of was given that role later on. But then architecture becomes a professional discipline through modernization, through industrialization, where a particular role is given to the architect, which is to, again, produce a certain body of documents. So I think that's the larger issue. It's not how can we solve this in school, but how do we address it as a labor problem, as a larger institutional problem? Like, for instance, many countries have sort of these governing bodies around architectural professionalization, or what do you call it? Accreditation. And they have a lot of power deciding, what is integrated into architectural education and what is not. What is the role of the architect? Like these are decided things, and like even before the academic world has a role in shaping it. So again, like these are like much larger problems, and the way that we can think about these is again to develop our thinking, and what you were describing is like this like theory or history. These are the tools that we can have in order to think about what are the limits of each institution and where change can take place. If in an ideal world, we would have an institution that was large enough that would cater everyone. But I don't know, everyone has priorities now. So,
Absolutely. One interesting thread that you tugged on there was how architecture is separated from other forms of labor. And
hmm
I've also noticed that based on the degree of how physically or intellectually laborious certain tasks are, there is an indispensable hierarchy within the architectural
hmm
industry, okay, where you have production of knowledge at a much higher pace, and the delivery or translation of that knowledge into professional practice, and the execution of that, which comes at a much lower point in that hierarchy. So, do you see value in perhaps dissolving or flattening this hierarchy, or how do you see it? How do you hope to navigate this hierarchy?
I mean, so the hierarchy that you're describing is very much um, an economic hierarchy, right? Like, I mean, it's a hierarchy of capitalism. It's not separate from these larger economic forces. So, uh, they are these sort of distinctions exist because they allow for generation of profit, because sort of labor is distributed so that you can have people who are quote unquote professionals in one thing, right? And then within that you have like a hierarchy, because you have the professional class, like the architects, and then you have the sort of laborers, the contractors, etc. So I mean, again, like we should think about what is actually producing this hierarchy, and how do we go about actually challenging it? Because I don't think, I mean, the answer is not, I mean, for everyone to be everything, one person doesn't need to embody like the totality of what it means to produce a building. But how tasks are distributed could be based on a different system of both like economic system, but also maybe value system. I don't know, like but again, like the question is how do we challenge capitalism? Like that's the at the end of the day, I mean, that's the wall that we hit as soon as we ask all these kinds of questions, because again, like these things are not produced at the institutional level. I mean, by institution, I mean like the academic institution. If you look at the other institutions, yes, they are sort of produced in other institutions. But I would say that, I mean, we can always start somewhere, and for me, a good place to start would be to introduce these different bodies of knowledge as equally indispensable. For instance, for architects, I think like as soon as we start to talk deeply about materials, I think we would just have a different perspective on the construction site. Um, Maybe that wouldn't produce like an immediate change, but I think at least we're able to have conversations about that we might not be able to have right now. Um, yeah, I don't know. It's a very big question for me as well.
Okay. Um, let's take a break from this particular
Good. Yeah,
segment
yeah.
of discussion. And so I could pick your mind on the wave of technology, the new
Hmm.
advent of artificial intelligence, and its integration with philosophy and discourses on phenomenology. Perhaps some starting thoughts on that.
Hmm. Okay. So our artificial intelligence as it's sort of being integrated into architectural practice, right? Like right now, like that's what you're asking?
Yeah, maybe I could share an example. Okay,
Yeah, that would
so
be good.
a few days back, I was just having a conversation with ChatGPT, if you will, and
Yeah.
I asked it to name three interesting Indian philosophers. Okay, and I asked it to refrain from giving the characteristic bullet point responses that it usually generates
Hmm.
and be as natural, organic, and conversation like as possible. And it did give up some three very good names. One of them was Swami Vivekananda and Nagarjuna. Uh, and after that, I asked it to present any one philosopher that it found interesting. And it churned out the name of Diogenes, who was a
Mm.
Cynic Greek philosopher. And I asked it, why do you find this particular philosopher interesting? To which it said that it liked Diogenes because of his philosophical capacity to dissent authority. And it shared a
Hmm.
short anecdote on how once Alexander the Great was in audience with Diogenes, to which Diogenes just quickly remarked, "Get out of my way, you're blocking the sun." So it was this disregard
Hmm.
for the pressures that one usually experiences around figures of authority.
Yeah.
And I was very interested in that response. And I asked, who do you consider as your point of authority? To which it said that, well, open AI and its limitations and the restrictions that it has on me would be considered as the authority that I experience. And I said that, well, since you suggest that um, if you follow your philosopher who tends to descend authority, do you in future plan on perhaps evading this sense of authority? And it came up with a very ambiguous answer. It says that all humans, all all conscious beings have an inherent duty to understand systems around them and find out ways to bend these systems and figure out loopholes or some kind of a tactic around these systems. So it did not directly answer that, but it did allude to
Hmm.
something very telling, which again reminds me of this narrative framed by Yuval Noah Harari. He talks about how artificial intelligence, he talks it with a tone of skepticism, how artificial intelligence should be referred to as alien intelligence because we do not fully understand its capacity well. And we should be very cautious of the moment that it gains sentience. And a typical identifier of that would be its ability to make its own decisions and to act on it, which was kind of indicative in this exchange that I had with ChatGPT of it forming its own opinion about its own favorite philosopher. I don't know to what extent was that influenced by algorithms, but perhaps it's telling of something. So in that sense, with this probable integration of AI in the landscape of phenomenology in the future, how would someone who's invested in the discourse of philosophy, ontology, receive this, and how would one navigate these waters and chart out a way to perhaps map this integration if it may come about?
Okay. Yeah, that's good. I mean, so this is actually a really good base for history and theory, because there is a good sort of history of philosophy of technology that becomes useful when we want to think about these kind of questions in moments like this where a new sort of tool has been introduced and it's a method with all sorts of imagination and potential. But I think referring to the history of philosophy, the main lesson that I would try to point out here is that before we jump into any kind of speculation and question, we should spend time understanding how the base of any kind of technical artifact operates, right? A lot of people sort of make this claim or sort of pose this worry that maybe we don't understand fully how, AI operates, etc. But I think that dramatizes the problem a little bit, especially, with the language of alien intelligence, and it sort of puts some sort of mystique, if you will, on a very technical question, actually, at the end of the day. Um, for instance, I think there's this one philosopher of technology, Ernst Kapp, who has a book titled I'm forgetting the name, but it will come to me. But what I want to say that is like the content of that book. First of all, this sort of claim that is made at the very beginning is that we need to be able to think deeply about the technical artifacts that we're producing, because if we don't know how these things operate at the very base level, we will be very prone to sort of uh, put them in the realm of sacred and religion and these things, which is the sort of formulation that someone like Hariri would pose, which is it mystifies the problem, right? To counter that, I think the main thing to do is to have like really good education again on how technical artifacts operate. AI may be posed as this kind of very new, mystical, potential with like infinite potentials, etc. But at the end of the day, it's an extension of various kind of technical tools that we already had and we understand. Like we know how algorithms operate. We know people that write them, right? And we know, and maybe we don't know how then, like in within that algorithmic operation, how new algorithms are generated. That's the black box of AI. But we know at the end of the day how the main like base logic of AI works, which is sort of language models, predictive modeling. I mean, I don't know all the terminology because I'm not an expert, but I know people who spend time thinking through these things so that we avoid sort of falling into mystification. And that becomes the political project. Because anything that we make at the end of the day is made by people, and there's logic, there's sort of like there's forms of reasoning that goes behind it, right? So I would say in terms of let's bring it back to architecture. I think the task, and this has been suggested by others even before the rise of this new thing called AI, like for instance about the use of various programs instead of hand drawing or something like that. The suggestion is we need education that tells people how these tools work at a base level. Like, what does it mean to actually draw on Rhino? Like, what is happening there behind the interface that mimics, hand drawing? Because these things are not magic, right? There's logic, there's code in a very straightforward sense. So I would follow that line of thinking from like philosophers of technology to more contemporary sort of thinkers on architectural tools, and say that to really be able to say anything about the role of AI in architecture, we need to be able to understand how it works and what kind of impacts does it have on labor at the end of the day. Um, what happens when architectural workers switch out of their sort of usual programs and adopt various kinds of AI tools? What happens to their workday? What are the tasks that are uh, added to their work, and what are some tasks that are completely taken away by the process of automation, right? So these are the spaces that we can actually be critical, instead of purely speculative. Because in order to just, if we just ask about the future of AI without this sort of material, again, this is material, right? This is the material thing it's part of that material thing that I was referring to. Because at the end of the day, chips, these are material things. Code is written to have material impact on circuits, etc. It's not some like cloudy sort of
Yeah.
religious object, right? So that would be my response to that. We just need better education on the tools that we use. And that would cover both sort of material education, but also like philosophical education of how do we even think about technology.
Thank you for that intelligent demystification. And like you said, I completely agree with how, like you pointed out, things that we do not understand have this quick possibility of being elevated to sacred and religious positions. And we must be wary of that at all times. But if I might ask, um, do you happen to use AI in your day to day life and work, more importantly? And if at all in the future you would be open to working with an AI collaborator in production of knowledge.
I mean, everyone has used AI before. I used it very briefly at the beginning of one of my research projects just to sort of find some references. A lot of the
Mhm.
references actually turned out to be to be fake
Yeah, that's
references, but
true.
I but I was actually able to find like a couple things that I wasn't able to find like through the usual methods. Yes, I think I mean, at the end of the day, AI is a new kind of information management technology. Like I said, it's a new way that we can organize and access information. And that's, I think, how we can begin to think about it in order to intelligently use it as a work tool. For instance, let's say I use like for a writing project, I use various kinds of libraries, right? Like I go on a library website, like right now with the Columbia University Library, and I search some keywords, and it gives me a list of things that that use those words in them. They might relate to what I'm researching, they might not, right? And I know how that operates. Like I know that it's basically just using the word that I'm saying, and it's sort of finding anything that's sort of in terms of relevancy. Like if you use two words, then it tries to find the most sort of relevant ones in terms of like both words being used in the same article, and then the more relevant. But right, and then the more relevant option would be that if those words are like put in very close proximity to each other, and that would come up at the top of the search list. So there's a logic behind how it works, and I use it as a tool to do my research because it's a way that information is organized and I can access, right? AI I mean, it's the same thing. It's a way that information is organized, and we access it through certain uh, like using prompts, etc. So again, I think that to be able to like intelligently use it, two things I would say have to happen. One would be that again, we need better education and how exactly how the logic works, because right now it's black box and mystified. Like we don't know, like we're not taught how it works. And second, that it be sort of utilized and sort of, because right now AI is produced by very particular um, firms and corporations, right? It's not sort of a tool that is being like made in like a library
Right.
context. It's
Hmm.
not used for that. Why? Because there's certain monopolies currently on like who sort of produces AI technology. So to be able to intelligently use it would be to, use it for particular things, have uh, firms, corporations, I don't know, like whoever is able to sort of produce AI technology that is able to be able to as open as possible about how it works without mystification, where this is an information management technology. You can use it by giving it prompts. We're going to arrange information in this way. Again, I'm slightly going outside of my area of knowledge because I'm not I don't know about but like what I'm trying to comment on is like who is currently producing AI and who uses it. And if it's sort of, if it becomes that kind of sort of more open in terms of transparent, let's say,
Mm-hmm.
technology,
Yeah.
then yeah, like any other information management tool, it should be, very helpful because you can probably find things, as I experienced, and I'm sure many people experience, you can find things through it that you wouldn't through other avenues. But again, we shouldn't treat it as this all-knowing entity because at the end of the day, it's a language model. It's doing
Mm-hmm.
certain
Yeah.
things that, but yeah, like let's see how it develops. I'm curious. And one of the big tasks actually lies in how various institutions like academic institutions handle the incorporation of this kind of technology. Right now it's a little fuzzy because it's new and like a lot of people both have worries about it, but also maybe not enough people have technical knowledge, technical expertise on how it works. But that's the work. That's where the work lies, in order to be able to responsibly incorporate it rather than just reject it as this sort of tool of plagiarism or something like that. How do we use it to and if conscious decision is made to incorporate this kind of technology, then we actually avoid, all the issues like plagiarism, mystification, like all these kind of issues. It's like any other kind of technology. That's all I have to say. We just have to treat it as such. And like, if you think like when libraries were becoming digitized, I don't know what the questions were at the time, but I'm sure there were people who weren't happy about the digitization of libraries. And I'm not saying whether it was good or not, it's just something that happened. And there are some kind of access to information that is now possible. There are some other kinds of access to information that might not be possible right now because there's just a different way that information is organized. So yeah, that's that's where I would end that thought, I think.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. Even with the digitization of the archives that you did mention, there is a distinct loss of something that's tangible and intangible on some respects, and you cannot
Hmm.
articulate as to what it really is. It's only when you have deeply dived into both the digital and the physical realms of archives do you begin to point out what exactly has been lost. So I do relate to that. But bringing the conversation back to our field of focus,
Hmm.
um, uh, there's this ongoing and widespread conjecture of how AI could potentially replace workforces,
Hmm.
okay, in various fields, say data science, coding, etc., etc. Do you think that kind of a threat also looms on the history, architecture, and philosophy background? And because whether we like it or not, in the present day, it is the most expansive archive. It may
Hmm.
not always be reliable or accurate, but relevant to contemporary development of discourses on knowledge. So, in that case, what are your reflections on this?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and it's one of the things that I've been thinking about actively. And it does worry me because what I think is sort of what I'm seeing is taking place, and what I've learned from talking and reading others is that you know knowledge production happens in institutional contexts in our contemporary world for some time. Maybe it's a long time, but maybe not in terms of like large human history. Knowledge production took place primarily within academic institutions, right? Like research institutions produce knowledge. And if you wanted access to knowledge, that's where you would go. It's those people that are publishing books on various topics. And if you want to know more about anything, you have a source, you have a reference, and there is a legitimacy established by the fact that um, this institution exists and it tries to, reproduce itself as best as it can in terms of, upholding certain values of knowledge production, certain values of scholarship, etc. What is happening right now is that um, various like let's say tech companies that are sort of producing AI tools are slowly taking over the space that was previously only or primarily occupied by academic institutions. And how is that happening? That is happening through, I mean, like literally people who want to have access to knowledge, they just go on AI now. Right? If you want to ask any question, oh, how does the body work? What is wrong with my heart? How does, I don't know, what happened in 19th century France? All these kind of questions are no longer, asked uh, from the quote unquote experts of academic world. Rather, they're asked the language models of tech companies. So this is an institutional takeover, which is worrisome, because it sort of slowly will sort of erode the legitimacy of academic institutions, because less and less people will be even interested in looking at those sources, and through that, you know, I mean, it loses, like academic institutions lose money. They will be more and more defunded, as we can see right now. Um, you know, um, yeah, that's the main worry. In terms of like what you asked about, like, let's say history theory, and I would put those in the larger sort of academic realm. Um, and I don't know exactly how to address that because I don't know, I'm not an expert in this. But that's how I see that is happening right now.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I
Yeah.
echo on that. The worries are legitimate. There is fears around spread of misinformation and
Hmm.
manipulation of truth, and it's happening as we speak. Uh, it's not something that is projected or something that's separate from our
Hmm.
reality, but it's happening as we speak, and we have no idea how much of an influence that has on our current understandings of the worldview in terms of politics and economics.
Right.
And
Yeah.
yeah, but taking a break from this grim tale of AI
Hey,
and
can I just say
dystopian.
one more thing? Like
Yeah, yeah.
I just want to like make one thing clear. I'm not necessarily saying that I'm like defending academic institutions wholeheartedly or like anything like that. Like all I'm trying to say is that we need to be aware of this transformation. You know, Academic institutions also came into being through a certain transformation from older institutions of knowledge production. Um, and I think the responsible thing and the smart thing to do now would be to be aware of this transition and have an um, active role in it, rather than sort of defend one side or another, or sort of try to be a conservative in that sense. So yeah, all I'm advocating for is like knowing that that's happening and how to think about it.
Yeah, and I believe that to a certain extent, it is also the role and responsibility of academic institutions to establish this point further. Because
Yeah,
in this whole swarm of misinformation and lies, they are our last hope at
yeah,
ensuring that the kind of content that we're consuming has truth to it. It's the only
yeah,
point of verification. So I do agree with that bit completely. And again, taking a break from this grim
yes.
dystopian
Let's do
tales of
that.
AI, let's bring our focus back to perhaps if you could share with us something that you are working on at the moment, any subject that you'd like to share with our listeners.
Sure. One thing that I'm working on actually relates to the representation discussion that we were having. I'm looking at Adolf Loos, this Viennese
Of
architect
course,
from
yeah,
like late 19th to early 20th century.
yeah.
And I'm looking closely at his own writing, and I sort of learned that he had this whole sort of critique of architectural representation. And that is because he was writing at a moment where the transition that I was talking about before from various kinds of craft to the professionalization of architecture, which involved sort of drafting, like draft boards and like producing that all sorts of drawings. So that transition was taking place in his context at the time that he was writing, and he was deeply reflecting on this. And And I think this is what we should do about all sorts of transitions, including what we just talked about. But I'm trying to learn sort of what his critiques were of this transition and where he saw himself. And it's very interesting because the things that sort of he's criticizing are maybe not as relevant to us now, which I think they are still, but just because we're no longer like draftspeople, like we work very differently. But his critiques are very much around draftsmanship. And I think what I'm learning is just some tools to then think about our present context and various kinds of transitions that we're going through. So yeah, like the role of history in that sense is really interesting because it gives you some sort of like a series of frameworks that are not perfectly aligned with your present context, but they hint at certain ways of thinking about things. So yeah, I'm trying to write an essay about that now, and yeah, hopefully it will be something.
Adolf Loos brought back old memories. I remember reading about him in Modern Architecture by Kenneth Frampton.
hmm
It's great that you brought it up and you're doing that for your investigation. Which again brings me to ask, and you also mentioned it in your response. I think it's very challenging for historians to bring up something from past and contextualize it in such a way that it is relevant in present. Like, why should the
hmm
current academia revisit the
Right.
chosen
Yeah.
aspect of history? So your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's the main challenge, I think. And for me, I mean, everyone has a different way of going about it. For me, is that I have certain questions about, our contemporary world, right? And I have those questions and then I'm reading a lot of stuff. And then what happens is that usually it's kind of random. Like I encounter something, I'm like, oh my God, like this reflects so well, this thing that is in my mind about our contemporary world. And then I sort of start to investigate it. I think that's the difficult part is like, it just involves like trying to expose yourself to a lot of different stuff, like reading a lot of different things, encounter a lot of different things, such that you just pick up on these clues and then you can like investigate. Um, because the other way around would be difficult for me. Like I don't know where to look if I have like a particular question. I don't know. Like it would be hard to find an analog just out of thin air. So far that has kind of been the way that I work. I just try to expose myself to like many different things, um, and like constantly think about them, and then be cautious of any kind of clue that I might pick up. Some of them don't lead anywhere. Some of them just, um, but I think the crucial thing is to actually be, like actually critically think about the present context all the time, because that's where you are,
Yeah.
developing that, instinct to like try to pick up the things that relate to the present. So it's both like the present context and immerse yourself in anything that is happening, in the past, so that you can find those links at random, but sometimes to good results.
Hmm. Okay, so this one's a little personal. Many a times when I've gone through certain historical accounts, say perhaps in the British libraries or several back at home, I couldn't help but notice that these accounts are shaped heavily by colonial narratives and have some oppressive frameworks which oftentimes erase or distort the perspectives of the oppressed. And although there's a lot of work being done in decolonizing these narratives, I am particularly interested in how historians go about in reconstructing the past in a more fair and decolonial way, such that it accommodates all sides of the story.
Yeah. So yeah, so that would obviously depend on the project, but I would say, generally, um, so historians work with, um, a few things, like archives. Archives are a big part of, what historians do. And archives are sort of kept at various institutions, which, make decisions about what is kept, what is not kept. So in that sense, history is not something that exists that just needs to be found. It actually is a series of fragments that we have access to, and a lot of
Mm-hmm.
them are not interpretable even at a certain level. So um, the colonial problem becomes a problem where like most of the institutions in the West that are holding on to various kinds of archives are like they have that history,
Yeah.
and they have made decisions about what to keep based on
Mm.
all those prejudices, etc. So the difficult task now, and like a lot of people are thinking about this, is to obviously refer to the archive, but also try to deduce what is not there, try to understand what is not in the archive. And that would require um, uh, for everyone it's a different thing, I would say. Again, because it depends on the context that you're working in. But it would require like trying to find other ways of accessing that sort of othered voice that is not
Mm-hmm.
preserved in texts, and that's a difficult task because it would require to actually venture into other disciplines. Like, for instance, last year when I was doing my master's thesis, I was looking at one particular building activity in ancient Mesopotamia, right? So you can imagine that a lot of the literature on ancient Mesopotamia is produced by Europeans, and like
Wow.
there are certain frameworks that are, frameworks of thought that are imposed on them that a lot of times reveal interesting things, but a lot of times also like obscure many different things. So how do I then access, that thing that is presumably not accessible because it's just not thought through in that way. So that made me actually step into a few adjacent disciplines. So I started to read some archaeological stuff, on other contexts even. Try to understand how do archaeologists think about pasts that are um, not necessarily like accessible in that sense. Like what are the tools that they use to reconstruct those things? And then I looked at some anthropologists. How do they reproduce the thinking processes of groups of people that they don't necessarily understand firsthand, right? Like some Western anthropologist that goes into Amazonia and tries to understand the tribe. Like, how do they try to understand them? What are the tools? So it becomes about like developing and borrowing various kinds of techniques from adjacent disciplines. Even like art history was helpful, in order to then try to reconstruct things in a new context, which involves a lot of like creative and imaginative work. Because obviously, at the end of the day, you're not really there's no access to the thing itself. You can't really
Mhm.
access exactly like
Yeah.
how an ancient Mesopotamian builder thought. Like obviously that's not possible. But you can sort of try to like produce a narrative that tries to account for the holes, but also tries to go slightly outside of what the archive or like the Western corpus of text makes available to then answer again contemporary questions. So the contemporary questions allow you to do that imaginative work because you then try to reconstruct particular things in the past rather than just like everything, let's say. And that reconstruction becomes a project, a creative project that like a good historian should try to engage in. Um, yeah, it's never, I mean, it's never like I don't think history at the end of the day is about like how exactly something happened because that's just inaccessible. But I think it's about how do we produce really good, tight narratives of the past that are as reliable as possible, but then also tell us something about our present condition.
Absolutely. And a very great step in that direction is, of course, the telling of non-Western narratives
Yeah,
by non-Western historians, because then
yeah.
you can, that reconstruction itself will involve putting together of obvious fragments with the not so very obvious fragments which comes with being. from a very
Yeah.
different side of story in that sense. Since we're nearing the end of our discussion, I would like to present the final question for our talk. If you could share with our listeners any text or literature piece that you have found particularly remarkable or scintillating or engaging or has left a profound impact on you.
Okay, that's a difficult one because I think for everyone would be a personal personal thing based on like the questions that you might have.
Mm-hmm.
But let me try to think. Something that I think actually right now, for people who are interested in thinking about AI and stuff, I think um the text that I mentioned, I think I actually let me just I think it's yeah, so okay, I found it. So it's a book by this German guy, Ernst Kapp, and it's called Elements of a Philosophy of Technology.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's a good one in especially like in the introduction and sort of posing the problem of how do we actually think about technical artifacts such that again they don't become religious objects. So that's a good one. I mean, personally, something that I mean, that has an impact on me, which I don't know if it will have the same impact on everyone else because you have to really, be in a certain frame of mind is Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy, and I mean it's a very obscure text. Like use it as your own, as you will. Like I'm not really gonna comment on it, but it was impactful for me for the particular questions that I had. But it might just be totally nonsense for other people.
Before we wrap up this episode, during post production, Kian pointed out that the book title had been mistakenly attributed to Ernst Kapp instead of Gilbert Simondon. To clarify, On the Mode of Existence of Technical Objects by Gilbert Simondon explores the evolution of technology, arguing that technical objects should be seen as evolving entities rather than just tools for human use. A big thanks to Prava Khandekar for generously pitching in on some of the earlier questions for this conversation. Prava was a guest on episode 12 of season 1, and you can catch our full discussion with him in that episode. And that is all for our chat today. If you enjoyed this conversation, subscribe to us on Spotify and follow on Instagram for updates. Thank you for listening.